Hi guys, welcome to another video on the Sign of 4. I hope that you're all keeping safe and that you're continuing to do the work that I set. We don't have many more chapters to go now, so hopefully soon enough these videos can come to an end. So this chapter, the Baker Street Irregulars, before we start talking about it, let's just recap chapter 7, the episode of the barrel. So in the episode of the barrel, we see Holmes and Watson using a sniffer dog to follow the trace of creosote from Pondicherry Lodge to where they believe that the criminals are going to be hiding. Unfortunately, this leads them to a dead end when Toby, the sniffer dog, takes them to a lumber yard, a place that would use a lot of creosote. Obviously, the place where the criminals aren't staying. This chapter picks up straight from there, and we're going to kind of see the resolution to this creosote trail. It will take them to a boatyard. They're going to find out a little bit about a ship called the Aurora, which Sherlock Holmes strongly believes that Jonathan Small and his associate are going to try and use for their escape. Now, this chapter deals a lot with class. We're going to see a lot of references to class, a lot of the opinions of the lower class from the upper class, and this will come across two encounters. The first with the wife of the owner of the Aurora, and secondly with the Baker Street Irregulars. We're going to further see Holmes's use of observation, deduction and knowledge. We're also going to see more of Sherlock Holmes's skills coming out within this chapter. So, as before, I'm going to read it through. We'll talk about some annotation. Let's get started. So bearing in mind that they've come to this dead end at this lumber yard and the chapter starts, "What now?" I asked. "Toby has lost his character for infallibility. He acted according to his lights," said Holmes, lifting him down from the barrel and walking him out of the timber yard. "If you consider how much creosote is carted about London in one day, it is no great wonder that our trail should have been crossed. It is much used now, especially for the seasoning of wood. Poor Toby is not to blame. We must get on the main scent again, I suppose. Yes, and fortunately we have no distance to go." Evidently, what puzzled the dog at the corner of Knight's Place was that there were two different trails running in opposite directions. We took the wrong one. It only remains to follow the other. There was no difficulty about this. On leading Toby to the place where we had committed his fault, he cast about in a wide circle and finally dashed off in a fresh direction. "We must take care that he does not now bring us to the place where the creosote barrel came from," I observed. "I had thought of that, but you notice that he keeps on the pavement, whereas the barrel passed down the roadway. No, we are on the true scent now." It tended down towards the riverside, running through Belmont Place and Princes Street. At the end of Broad Street it ran right down to the water's edge, where there was a small wooden wharf. Okay, let's continue. Let's stop there. So a few points to make on this page, not a lot to get into. So Toby has lost his character for infallibility. This means that Toby is no longer always right, that Toby is stuck to an extent. This foreshadows the next chapter, A Break in the Chain, because we will see that Holmes, like Toby, ends up kind of stuck. The scent for Holmes runs out, in the same way that it's run out for Toby. Then Watson says, "We must get on the main scent again, I suppose." So this could be interpreted in two ways. So literally, they need to find the right path. So they need to make sure that they're following the correct path to the creosote. But metaphorically, it may mean they need to refocus on the case a little. And Holmes here shows his supreme confidence. We are on the true scent now. Holmes shows that he feels that they're doing the right thing now. And I just want to think about these questions as we go forwards. How is this chapter exploring class? And how does Conan Doyle write negatively about the working class? These are big questions for this chapter. Okay, let's move on. Oh, let me move that. So Toby led us to the very edge of this, and there stood whining, looking out on the dark current beyond. "We are out of luck," said Holmes. "They have taken to a boat here. Several small punts and skiffs were lying about in the water and on the edge of the wharf. We took Toby round to each in turn, but though he sniffed earnestly, he made no sign. Close to the rude landing stage was a small brick house with a wooden placard slung out through the second window. Mordecai Smith was printed across it in large letters, and underneath, boats to hire by the hour or day. A second inscription above the door informed us that a steam launch was kept, a statement which was confirmed by a great pile of coke upon the jetty. Sherlock Holmes looked slowly round, and his face assumed an ominous expression. "This looks bad," said he. "These fellows are sharper than I expected. They seem to have covered their tracks. There has, I fear, been preconcerted management here." He was approaching the door of the house when it opened, and a little curly-haired lad of 6 came running out, followed by a stoutish, red-faced woman with a large sponge in her hand. "You come back and be washed, Jack," she shouted. "Come back, you young imp. For if your father comes home and finds you like that, he'll let us hear of it." "Dear little chap," said Holmes strategically. "What a rosy-cheeked young rascal. Now, Jack, is there anything you would like?" The youth pondered for a moment. "I'd like a shilling," said he. Okay, so let's now get into this. This is a few little points on Toby in the case, and then we're going to get into the things about class. So, Toby is there stood whining. This shows that he's distressed, that he has lost the scent. He's distressed that he's not been able to complete his function, very similar to Holmes. And some foreshadowing across the rest of the novel when he talks about how the canal was a dark current beyond, the dark current beyond. It foreshadows that bad things will happen on the Thames, bearing in mind that this is the Thames River. But at the same time, dark current beyond, that might show that the mystery is going to develop, that Holmes is going to find it difficult to see what's actually happening, difficult to proceed with the case. If darkness is ahead, and we've looked at this across the whole novel so far, this idea of light and dark. Darkness here could represent danger, it could represent the unknown, it could represent a loss of ability, Holmes's loss of abilities. So the plot, they've taken to a boat here. Obviously, Toby can't follow the scent because they're now on the water. And here the trail ends. So now we get onto the class things. So this is a description of Mordecai Smith's business. It's a building on the edge of the Thames that hires boats to people. And it's described as a rude landing stage. Now, rude here doesn't refer to it being not polite. Rude would be a contraction of the word rudimentary. So a very basic, small landing stage. Probably some bits of plank now together into a little kind of pier, and yeah, it's basic. The small brick house, again, the idea that it is basic, they don't have very much. And then we have the use of the verb slung, a wooden placard slung out through the second window. This, I think, is Conan Doyle showing his attitude towards the lower classes. Slung shows that it was not done with care, shows that maybe these people aren't so concerned with neatness and detail in the way that most people in Victorian society would be. To clarify, coke is a form of coal. And again, it's a little bit more foreshadowing that Holmes looks at this scene with an ominous expression. Now here I've written that he's worried that they are gone, but also it might be worried that he's now got to deal with some other people. Bearing in mind that Holmes isn't very good at dealing with people, that he isn't able to read their emotions very well. It could be something to do with that. Holmes here shows that he underestimated Jonathan Small and Tonga. He says these fellows are sharper than I expected, showing that he believed that this was going to be pretty simple. And I fear there has been preconcerted management, a plan. Holmes didn't expect them to have a plan. Again, he's underestimating them. So now we get a description of this working class woman, Mordecai Smith's wife. Holmes describes her as stoutish and red-faced. So again, this links to the idea that she's big and unhealthy. She's carrying a large sponge in her hand. This shows that she is doing domestic work. Her principal role is to look after the family while Mordecai Smith goes out to work. So alongside class here, we have a little comment about the role of women. Bearing in mind, the women that we've seen so far, people like Mrs. Bernstein, I can't remember her name, but Sherlock Holmes and Watson's servant, these are all women. So within this novel, apart from Mary Morstan, whose job is a governess, so she's kind of doing this work anyway, women seem to be there to look after men. And this is very much the case with Mrs. Smith here. She then shouts, "You come back and be washed, Jack." This shows that the working classes are dirty. In particular, the children are dirty, possibly negligent on the parents' part, possibly a cultural kind of idea because the children don't really have access to baths and the things that maybe upper class children would have access to. Now, this is particularly interesting. She says, "For if your father comes home and finds you like that, he'll let us hear of it." So this shows that the father, Mordecai Smith, would blame Mrs. Smith as much as he would blame Jack for not being washed. And at the same time, there's a little reference to potential domestic violence. This, "he'll let us hear of it," could be seen as an idiom for, he's going to beat us both. If he comes back and you're not washed, he's going to hit me and he's going to hit you. And this is done in quite a offhand manner. There's not much sympathy developed for Mrs. Smith here. It's just, this is a fact. And indeed, it would have been a fact in Victorian society. Domestic violence was much more prevalent, but it doesn't make it right. And I think in some way shows, again, Conan Doyle's attitude towards the working class. They are dirty, they are unhealthy, they're only good for domestic chores. The violence within the home is normal and tolerated within working class families. It's only a little thing, but there's a lot that you can get from it. So now Holmes says strategically. This word here shows that Holmes is altering his tone and the things that he says to try and manipulate these working class people. So he says, "What a rosy young cheeked young rascal," trying to get on the side of these people, trying to manipulate them into thinking that this guy's a nice guy. So he says, "What would you like?" The youth pondered for a moment. "I'd like a shilling," he said. And again, this is Conan Doyle showing his attitude towards the poor. This isn't yet Holmes showing his attitude. This is the author's attitude. And this speaks of the fact that the poor only want money. That they, when offered with something, will say, "Cash, give me cash, I need some cash." But at the same time, it talks of having a limited view of the world. This boy could have said £1. He could have said anything really, but he asks for what is a very small amount of money, a shilling. Let's just get this back then. Continue. "I'd like a shilling," he said. "Nothing you would like better?" "I'd like 2 shilling better," the prodigy answered after some thought. "Here you are then, catch. A fine child, Mrs. Smith. Lor bless you, sir, he is that and forward. He gets almost too much for me to manage, especially when my man is away days at a time." "Away, is he?" said Holmes in a disappointed voice. "I am sorry for that, for I wanted to speak to Mr. Smith. He's been away since yesterday morning, sir, and truth to tell, I'm beginning to feel frightened about him. But if it was about a boat, sir, maybe I could serve as well. I wanted to hire his steam launch. Why, bless you, sir, it is in the steam launch that he is gone. That's what puzzles me, for I know there ain't more coals in her than would take her about Woolwich and back. If he'd been away in the barge, I'd have thought nothing, for many a time a job he has taken him as far as Gravesend, and then if there was much doing, there he might have stayed over. But what good is a steam launch without coals? He might have bought some at a wharf down the river." "He might, sir, but it weren't his way. Many a time I've heard him call out that the prices they charge for a few odd bags. Besides, I don't like that wooden-legged man with his ugly face and outlandish talk. What did he always want knocking about here for?" "A wooden-legged man?" said Holmes with bland surprise. "Yes, sir. a brown, monkey-faced chap that's called more than once for my old man. Now let's continue. Let's continue. So here we see Holmes interacting with the working classes, and again thinking about how are the working classes represented, and think a little about this. How much does Holmes actually pay for this information? Because it kind of, I think that also links with his manipulation of the working class. So the boy, Jack, when asked what would you like more than 1 shilling, I'd like 2 shilling better. So this shows a little bit of cheekiness, but at the same time it shows again he's only really interested in money. He wants money within that limited framework for money. And just to highlight, a shilling, that was in the old days, that would be the equivalent of 12 pence. So not a great deal of money being exchanged here. We then get some working class dialect from Mrs. Smith. Law, bless you, sir, almost too much for me to manage, especially when my man is away days at a time. This shows a clear difference between working class characters and upper class characters. Holmes continues to speak in a formal way without clipping his words, without resorting to contractions. Mrs. Smith here uses contractions, drops hard consonants from the end of words, so rather than Lord, bless you, sir, law, bless you, sir. Contractions here are most too much for me to manage, especially when my man is away days at a time. And again, this talks about how working class mums potentially at this time struggle to control their children, potentially because their children are controlled by the dads with violence, and the mums just aren't able to do that. So we then get a clue. The idea that Mr. Smith is away days at a time. So he's been away for a long time. Bearing in mind now, I think this has been maybe 2 nights, is the chronology of the novel so far. So that would show that since Jonathan Small and his associate murdered Bartholomew, they jumped on the boat and they've been away ever since. So that's a clue. Holmes is here manipulating by talking in a disappointed voice. I am sorry to hear that, for I wanted to speak to Mr. Smith. So rather than actually coming out and saying, I believe that he has run away with a criminal here, Holmes is pretending like he's here on a matter of business. So he's trying to manipulate the working class by refusing to talk about anything dodgy. I'm beginning to feel frightened about him, so there we have more fear, that she is worried. And generally through this we just get more and more information about Mordecai Smith and the job that he's on. Then we have a reference to Jonathan Small. I don't like that wooden-legged man with his ugly face and outlandish talk. So this must be Jonathan Small. And definitely, the face, the hairiness, the wooden-leggedness. But the outlandish talk, I'm not quite sure what she means here. Maybe Jonathan Small has spoken a little about the treasure. Maybe he has been vague about his purpose for hiring the launch. We don't know. But definitely we're here talking about Jonathan Small. A brown, monkey-faced chap that's more than once for my old man. So this again links to the tan, the leathery nature of his skin. Maybe she sees him as actually not being British because of the tan, because British people wouldn't generally get tanned to the level that he would be. So maybe that's a fact there as well. Let's continue. So, it was him that roused him up yesternight. And what's more, my man knew he was coming, for he had steam up in the launch. I tell you straight, sir, I don't feel easy in my mind about it. But my dear Mrs. Smith, said Holmes, shrugging his shoulders, you're frightening yourself about nothing. How could you possibly tell that it was the wooden-legged man who came in the night? I don't quite understand how you can be so sure. His voice, sir. I know his voice, which is kind of thick and foggy. He tapped at the window, about 3 it would be. Show a leg, matey, says he. Time to turn out guard. My old man woke up Jim, that's my eldest, and away they went without so much as a word to me. I could hear the wooden leg clacking on the stones. And was this wooden-legged man alone? Couldn't say, I'm sure, sir. I didn't hear no one else. I am sorry, Mrs. Smith, for I wanted a steam launch, and I have heard good reports of the... Let me see. What is her name? The Aurora, sir. Ah, she's not that old green launch with a yellow line, very broad in the beam. No, indeed, she's as trim a little thing as any on the river. She's been fresh painted, black, with 2 red streaks. Thanks. I hope that you will hear soon from Mr. Smith. I'm going down the river, and if I should see anything of the Aurora, I shall let him know that you are uneasy. A black funnel, you say? No, sir. Black, with a white band. Ah, of course. It was the sides which were black. Good morning, Mrs. Smith. There is a boatman here with a wherry, Watson. We shall take it and cross the river. Okay, so again, we're seeing more of Sherlock Holmes manipulating Mrs. Smith, withholding information, trying to kind of wheedle out info from her about the boat without giving her any indication that he urgently needs to find it, which is a reason we'll come across on the next page. So we need to think about Sherlock Holmes is manipulating Mrs. Smith. So what does that show about his opinion of her? What does that show about his opinion of the working class? Would an upper class judge be as easy to manipulate in this fashion? Would an upper class businessman be would an upper class businessman be as easy to manipulate in this fashion? And also, what does this show about Conan Doyle's attitude towards the intelligence of the working classes? Are they clever enough to spot when somebody is digging for information? So within this, Mrs. Smith, she continues to worry. She doesn't feel easy in my mind about it. And then we have this metaphor that describes Jonathan Small's voice, kind of thick and foggy. Now, this might be for a couple of reasons. It could be Jonathan Small is fatigued. It could be Jonathan Small's regular voice. It could be Jonathan Small trying to put on a voice. We don't know, but definitely all three are there. It also kind of gives him a distinct voice, which helps Mrs. Smith to better identify it. If his voice is thick and foggy, then she hears a thick and foggy voice, and it must be him. And the second clue, she heard the wooden leg clacking on the stones. These are all clues to show that this definitely is Jonathan Small. But within this, Sherlock Holmes' manipulation, we see this when he says, I don't quite understand how you can be so sure that it was the wooden-legged man. He's asking for more information without even letting her know that he's looking for a wooden-legged man. There's no indication that they are trying to find a wooden-legged man. So now, the reference to the boat, the Aurora, sir. So I believe there is some symbolism behind the name Aurora. So this represents the Northern Lights, those wavy blue lights that you get in the very top of the Northern Hemisphere, sort of around Iceland and the North Pole. This is a rare sight. This boat will go on to be a rare sight. They won't be able to find it. They'll spend many days looking and searching for this boat. In the same way that if you were to try and see the Northern Lights within that northern part of the hemisphere, you might spend many days trying to find it. At the same time, in literature, aurora means dawn. This is the sun rising. Now, again, this could be a couple of ideas linking to this. It could relate to this is the next step in the case, that this is the next thing to shed light on the case, the name of the boat. But at the same time, it foreshadows the final showdown and the capture of Jonathan Small, which begins at night and goes into dawn. So a couple of pieces of symbolism behind the name of the boat, the Aurora. And here we see Holmes pretend to know what boat she's talking about. The old green launch with the yellow line, very broad in the beam. He's making things up. He's making things up to get the details out of her. This is like if I said to you, I'm well aware of the Russian-made uniform, those blue jumpers with grey trousers and pink shirts. You would say to me, no, grey trousers and black jumpers and white shirts, you might say. So he's digging for information without saying to Mrs. Smith, I need this information. I want this information. And it continues across these next. She does give him the information that he's looking for. She does tell him what the boat looks like. So the main thing, so now we're going to see, so they leave, they take the ferry, and go across the Thames. And here we're going to get to see Sherlock Holmes' reasoning, his rationale, and his opinion of the working class. So the main thing with people of that sort, said Holmes, as we sat in the sheets of the wherry, is never to let them think that their information can be of the slightest importance to you. If you do, they will instantly shut up like an oyster. If you listen to them under protest, as it were, you are very likely to get what you want. Of course, now seems pretty clear, said I. What would you do then? I would engage a launch and go down the river on the track of the Aurora. My dear fellow, it would be a colossal task. She may have touched at any wharf on either side of the stream between here and Greenwich. Below the bridge there is a perfect labyrinth of landing places for miles. It would take you days and days to exhaust them if you set about it alone. Employ the police, then? No. I should probably call Athelney Jones in at the last moment. He is not a bad fellow, and I should not like to do anything which would injure him professionally. But I have a fancy for working it out myself, now that we have gone so far. Could we advertise, then, asking for information from wharfingers? Worse and worse! Our men would know that the chase was hot at their heels, and they will be off out of the country. As it is, they are likely enough to leave, but as long as they think they are perfectly safe, they will be in no hurry. Jones's energy will be of use to us there, for his view of the case is sure to push itself into the daily press. Oh, what's happened here? Sorry about that. And the runaways will think that everyone is off on the wrong scent. Okay, so let's start with this, the attitude towards the working class. Holmes says the main thing with people of that sort. Now, to begin with, using that phrase, that sort of people, it's very derogatory. It's not complimentary of the people. And at the same time, it shows there is a very clear definition between us and them. That sort of people, they are separate from us, and we are in no way connected. I think that this shows that Holmes very much abides by the class system of Victorian society and believes that the working class should be down there with the working class, and the middle class should be there with the middle class, and the upper class should be there with the upper class. And he says here, never let them think their information can be of the slightest importance to you. If you do, they will instantly shut up like an oyster. So here he's saying, don't tell them that you're looking for information, because then they know that information is worth something, and they're going to ask you for money. We get the impression that for Holmes, money isn't that much of an issue. So why would he care about giving them actual proper amounts of money for their information rather than giving Jack a shilling? He's paid 12 pence for this information from a poor family living a life of poverty, sending boats out onto the Thames. He could have helped that family by giving them some real cash, but he chose not to because he knew that he could manipulate them and get away with it. There is also some symbolism around this simile, will instantly shut up like an oyster. This shows that Holmes recognises that the knowledge is valuable, like the pearl at the centre of the oyster. This also shows that the working classes would recognise that their knowledge was valuable, like the pearl in the centre of an oyster, showing that the working classes were more willing to use knowledge for financial gain. That they would try to get as much money out of Holmes as possible before giving him this knowledge. Overall, I think that this shows that Sherlock Holmes believes that there is a conflict between the upper classes and the working classes. The upper classes are trying to manipulate the working classes as much as possible to get them to do what they want, whereas the working classes are trying to squeeze every last penny out of the upper classes. We'll talk about this when we maybe cover some Marxist theory later on, but this links directly to conflict theory, the idea that the classes within a class system are always competing for resources. You know, in Holmes's case, the resource is knowledge and information. In Mrs. Smith's case, and the working class case, the resource is money. Okay. So now we see some more differences between Holmes and Watson. You know, Holmes poses to Watson, what would you do? How would you proceed with this? And Watson goes on to give a series of ideas that Holmes shoots down instantly every single time. You know, this shows that Watson isn't thinking about things logically in the way that Holmes is, and that Holmes isn't really prepared to take any of Watson's ideas on board. So the first one, so Watson says he would engage a launch and go down the river on the track of the Aurora. So he says, go and look for it in a boat. Holmes says that will be a really big task. You know, London's waterways were huge. The canal system was huge. And he goes on to describe them as a labyrinth. Again, this is the second reference to this in the novel. The idea that something is a labyrinth. Remembering the idea of a maze that is really difficult to solve with some beast at the centre of it that is violent and aggressive. Again, possibly linked to Jonathan Small. Employ the police then. I mean, this flies directly in the face of everything that we've seen around attitude towards the police. Holmes absolutely does not want the police involved. He believes that they are messing the case up. And Watson, his second idea is to go straight to the police. This shows kind of a desperate act. No. Remember these two. This is a good attitude toward the police set of quotations. To Watson's idea of employing the police, Holmes, no. It's a one-word answer. It is total rejection of that idea. He will not get the police involved until the last minute. That being said, Holmes goes on to say that I should not like to do anything which would injure him professionally, talking about Athelney Jones. This shows that Holmes doesn't want to hurt Athelney Jones's career, despite the fact that Athelney Jones has shown himself to be a poor policeman and a poor detective who is only really interested in fitting somebody up for a crime so that he can get on with his next job. Now, I think that this links to the idea that despite the fact that Holmes doesn't respect Athelney Jones, Holmes does, on some level, respect the patriarchy and the system of power that keeps these police officers in place. You know, he doesn't want to disrupt that by getting Athelney Jones fired or by raising concerns with Athelney Jones's boss. He just wants to humiliate him a little bit by being the one to solve the case. Then Watson goes on to say, you know, could we advertise asking for information from Wharfingers? Worse and worse. And this is the worst idea. Watson is saying here, publish in newspapers that they're looking for these people down by the River Thames. Surely Jonathan Small would see that in a newspaper and know that people were onto him. Okay. This hot at their heels, this is a nice little metaphor or possibly idiom, showing that Jonathan Small and Tonga would know that they would be onto. Now, we see more attitude towards the police, where Holmes says Jones's energy will be of use to us there, for his view of the case is sure to push itself into the daily press. This shows that Jones wants publicity, or the idea that this case would be leaked to the press by the police. Either way, it shows the police would damage the investigation, that Jones would quite happily promote himself before protecting the details of the case and the likelihood of this being solved correctly. Or it shows that the police are incompetent at holding on to confidential information. You know, either way, the police are not shown in a very good light there. And this leads Holmes to the conclusion that the runaways will think that everyone is off on the wrong scent. Holmes is going to use the police's incompetence here. And indeed, we will see this. You know, Athelney Jones publishes in the newspaper that Thaddeus Sholto, this master criminal, has been arrested and charged with the murder of his brother. That's going to make Jonathan Small and Tonga feel pretty confident, knowing that somebody else is in prison for their crime. Okay. Now let's continue. "So what are we to do then?" I asked as we landed near Millbank Penitentiary. "Take this hansom, drive home, have some breakfast, and get an hour's sleep. It is quite on the cards that we may be afoot tonight again. Stop at the telegraph office, cabby. We will keep Toby, for he may be of use to us yet." We pulled up at the Great Peter Street post office, and Holmes dispatched his wire. "Whom do you think that is to?" he asked as we resumed our journey. "I'm sure I don't know." "You remember the Baker Street division of the detective police force whom I employed in the Jefferson Hope case?" "Well," said I, laughing, "this is just the case where they might be invaluable. If they fail, I have other resources, but I shall try them first. That wire was to my dirty little Lieutenant Wiggins, and I expect that he and his gang will be with us before we have finished our breakfast." It was between 8 and 9 o'clock now, and I was conscious of a strong reaction after the successive excitements of the night. I was limp and weary, befogged in mind and fatigued in body. I had not the professional enthusiasm which carried my companion on, nor could I look at the matter as a mere abstract intellectual problem. As far as the death of Bartholomew Sholto went, I had heard little good of him, and could feel no intense antipathy to his murderers. The treasure, however, was a different matter. That, or part of it, belonged rightfully to Miss Morstan. Okay, let's start from here then. So, we've got a little bit of foreshadowing here. The Millbank Penitentiary, that they've got off the boat outside of prison. This foreshadows Jonathan Small's end. This is a little reference to justice and the justice system in the Victorian era, definitely. Holmes uses imperatives here. You know, he's kind of bossy of Watson, drive home, have some breakfast, take this hansom, all of this stuff. You know, Holmes is definitely leading the situation here. Yeah, the idea that they may be continuing the investigation later. We're going to see here, you know, Holmes doesn't necessarily need rest. And this is going to link him with a maxim we're going to talk about in a minute. Change is as good as a rest. Holmes, unlike most people, doesn't need food. He doesn't need sleep to sustain him. He's quite capable to continue on and on. Very different to Watson, as we're going to see towards the end of this chapter. So here we have reference now. This is the title of the chapter. The Baker Street Division of the Detective Force. The Baker Street Irregulars. This is a parody of the real police. The real police were known as the Regulars. So if you had a police station on Baker Street, they would be known as the Baker Street Regulars. Now, these young boys who we're going to see come into Holmes's house are the exact opposite of the police force. Hence the phrase the Baker Street Irregulars. This is a parody police force, shown through Watson's reaction to Holmes talking about it. "Well," said I, laughing. So Watson is amused by the idea. He doesn't take these children seriously. Are we to think a little about why that might be as we are presented with them? What about these boys means that Watson isn't going to take them seriously? Okay, now here we see that Watson is tired by the events. He talks about there being a strong reaction after the successive excitements of the night. He was limp, weary, befogged in mind and fatigued in body, showing that Watson couldn't think or act. A direct contrast to Holmes, who has professional enthusiasm, which carries him on. He sees this as an abstract intellectual problem, thinking about, this is like a puzzle, rather than there are actually people involved, rather than that the resolution of this case is going to impact on Mary Morstan's life, rather than seeing it like that, in the way that Watson does. Holmes is able to see this as just a set of riddles, a set of questions that need answering. These are all big differences between Holmes and Watson. Watson doesn't feel bad about Bartholomew Sholto's murder, but he does care for Mary Morstan. So he says here that part of the treasure belonged rightfully to Miss Morstan. This is what stops Watson from seeing the whole case as a problem to be solved. Right back to chapter 1, Holmes talks about Watson injecting too much romanticism in a case. Well, here we have it. Holmes has Watson has injected romanticism into this case through his feelings for Mary, and that leads him to being unable to kind of distance himself from the case and see it for what it actually is, just problems to be solved. Okay, so while there was a chance of recovering it, I was ready to devote my life to the one project. True, if I found it, it would probably put her forever beyond my reach, yet it would be a petty and selfish love which would be influenced by such a thought as that. If Holmes could work to find the criminals, I had a tenfold stronger reason to urge me on to find the treasure. A bath at Baker Street and a complete change freshened me up wonderfully. When I came down to our room, I found the breakfast laid and Holmes pouring out the coffee. "Here it is," said he, laughing and pointing to an open newspaper. "The energetic Jones and the ubiquitous reporter have fixed it up between them. But you have had enough of the case. Better have your ham and eggs first." I took the paper from him and read the short notice, which was headed "Mysterious Business at Upper Norwood." "About 12 o'clock last night," said the Standard, "Mr. Bartholomew Sholto, of Pondicherry Lodge, Upper Norwood, was found dead in his room, under circumstances which point to foul play. As far as we can learn, no actual traces of violence were found upon Mr. Sholto's person, but a valuable collection of Indian gems which the deceased gentleman had inherited from his father was being carried off. The discovery was first made by Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, who had called at the house with Mr. Thaddeus Sholto, brother of the deceased. By a singular piece of good fortune, Mr. Athelney Jones, the well-known member of the detective police force, happened to be at the Norwood police station and was on the ground within half an hour of the first alarm. His trained and experienced faculties were at once directed towards the detection of the criminals, with the gratifying result of the brother, Thaddeus Sholto, has already been arrested, together with the housekeeper, Mrs. Burnston, an Indian butler named Lal Rao, and a porter or gatekeeper named McMurdo. So we're going to stop there. So, just before we get onto the newspaper article, let's cover the kind of the lingering feelings that Watson has for Mary. This again talks about class and how Watson feels that once Mary is rich, she's not going to be accessible to him because she's going to be in a different class. He says, "True, if I found it, it would probably put her forever beyond my reach." Watson feels that, again, like I say, her becoming rich would mean that Watson would not be able to kind of go out with her, He wouldn't be able to be in a relationship with her because she's going to be in a different social circle. This links to the idea of him being worrying that he will be seen as a vulgar treasure seeker, that he is a half-paid doctor on a half salary, and she would be one of the richest heiresses in London. It links to, the "what worse, she was rich" statement. Watson really, really is worried about this so much. But at the same time, he really cares for Mary. He sees getting the treasure for her as a selfless act, that he is more than happy to deny himself this possible relationship if it means that he can help the person who he loves. Yeah. So here then, we now get some attitude towards the police. We are given a nice narrative device whereby we get the details of an article, the actual article included in the novel. This could be seen as another shifting narrative point. We've talked about this with other chapters. We now get shifting narrative point here. So we have some irony when Holmes refers to Jones as the energetic Jones. We know that he's not energetic. He's presented as quite a lazy character, quite an unhealthy character, thinking again about the plethoric, blood-red face, the breathlessness when he gets to the top of the stairs, the wheezing. All of this links with the idea that Jones isn't energetic, and Holmes is being ironic to make fun of Jones. The ubiquitous reporter have fixed it up between them. So Jones and the ubiquitous reporter have fixed it up between them. Just to define this word, ubiquitous, this is something that is common or found everywhere. So Holmes is saying here that reporters that are willing to kind of big up police officers that are willing to just report things that are told to them rather than investigate them are very, very, very common. And fixed it up. This is to show that they have made it up between them, that Jones and the reporter have made up this whole story rather than actually looking at facts and presenting anything factual. At the same time, there is additional imagery around the word fixed. A fix is a con forcing a result, such as Thaddeus Sholto's arrest. If you were to fix a race, then you are conning people to force a result that this person wins or this person loses. Here, Athelney Jones has fixed the case to make it look like Thaddeus Sholto is the one who has done it, leading to Thaddeus Sholto's arrest. We have some misreporting straight away. Holmes actually arrived at 11 o'clock, but it says about 12 o'clock last night the mysterious business was uncovered. So this would be the hour after Holmes has arrived and be actually when Athelney Jones arrived. So Athelney Jones here from the outset using false information to try and make himself look better at his job. Foul play, this relates to murder, that they're including the details that definitely Bartholomew Sholto was murdered. However, here is a lie. No actual traces of violence were found upon Mr. Sholto's person, except from the dart, the thing that Holmes pointed out to Athelney Jones on several occasions. The dart sticking out of his scalp. You could say that's a trace of violence. A name drop for Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. This is Athelney Jones covering his back in case Holmes were to come out and say, hang on a minute, I actually found it. Athelney Jones said, well, I've accredited you to the person that found it. I'm the person that solved it, though. And then we see Athelney Jones's ego boosted by the writer. A singular piece of good fortune and the well-known member of the detective police force. So the idea that Athelney Jones is a respected police officer and was very fortunate and it was very fortunate that Athelney Jones was called to the case. He's a top police officer. He's going to come in. He's going to solve this thing like no other police officer can do. And I think that this leads us to the conclusion that Athelney Jones, the journalist, would have probably written this piece together. That Athelney Jones would have given the journalist these ideas, and it's lazy on the journalist's part because Athelney Jones probably wrote that bit as well. By a singular piece of good fortune, I, a well-known member of the detective police force, happened to be in Norwood at that time. So, again, within half an hour of the first alarm, he arrived. I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure that's quite true. And then more on his ego, his trained and experienced faculties were at once directed towards the detection of the criminals. So we need to think, how is Athelney Jones hyped up in this report while Holmes has been ignored? And what does he show about police and journalism in Victorian England? We as the audience know this is a pack of lies. We were there when it was all gone through. We were there when Watson and Holmes discovered the body. We were there when Watson and Holmes put together what had happened and found the trapdoor going out to the roof. All of this stuff we see. So we know this is a pack of lies. So what does this show about Victorian attitude towards the police? Does this show that Victorians would have trusted the police, or that the police were particularly truthful? We have to think that this is Conan Doyle showing Victorian people the police are untrustworthy. Okay. And again, we could consider it dramatic irony because we know what's going on, because we saw what's happening. We, the audience, are aware of what's actually gone down. So I'll read from here. It is quite certain that the thief or thieves were well acquainted with the house, for Mr. Jones's well-known technical knowledge and his powers of minute observation have enabled him to prove conclusively that the miscreants could not have entered by the door or by the window, but must have made their way across the roof of the building, and so through a trapdoor into a room which communicated with that in which the body was found. This fact, which has been very clearly made out, proves conclusively that it was no mere haphazard burglary. The prompt and energetic action of the officers of the law shows the great advantage of the presence, on such occasions, of a single vigorous and masterful mind. We cannot but think that it supplies an argument for those who would wish to see our detectives more decentralised, and so brought into closer and more effective touch with the cases which it is their duty to investigate. "Isn't it gorgeous?" said Holmes, grinning over his coffee cup. "What do you think of it?" "I think that we have had a close shave ourselves of being arrested for the crime." "So do I. I wouldn't answer for our safety now if he should happen to have another of his attacks of energy." At this moment there was a loud ring at the bell, and I could hear Mrs. Hudson, our landlady, raising her voice in a wall of expostulation and dismay. "By heaven, Holmes," I said, half rising, "I believe that they are really after us." I'm going to stop there. Just to finish this newspaper article, thinking about, in fact, we'll deal with that in a moment. So the gratifying result, the idea that this is a good result, it's not a good result, because Thaddeus Sholto wasn't the one that murdered Bartholomew Sholto, because he couldn't have locked the door from the inside before leaving. And now we have more dramatic irony, Mr. Jones's well-known technical knowledge, and his powers of minute observation. Well, we know that Jones doesn't have very much technical knowledge, because he's unable to identify the dart as something that might be a murder weapon. He is very dismissive of Holmes when he talks about the round circular stump print on the windowsill. If that would be technical knowledge, using those forensic ideas to try and solve the case. Jones is not bothered. And again, his powers of minute observation. Well, he certainly hasn't seen the footprints in the attic, because otherwise he'd be saying that there were two people who did the murder. And again, he isn't very observant when it comes to the windowsill, or the creosote, or the rope, or any of these small details that Holmes was able to use to solve the case in this way. And we know that he lacks those skills. So again, this is dramatic irony. More with the prompt and energetic action of the officers of the law. And this, a single vigorous and masterful mind, the police think it is only one person who's committing this crime. Again, we know that it is two people. There can't be one person wearing boots with a wooden leg and another person who is going around with very small feet, barefooted, and they both be the same person. That's just not going to happen. So again, dramatic irony, we know that the police are wrong in this matter. Now I want you to think a little bit about this. How does the inclusion of the newspaper narrative develop mystery and show attitude towards the police? I'd like to take time at the top of your page. Just think a little bit. We've talked about attitude towards the police a lot in other chapters. Think about how this shows what Conan Doyle's attitude towards the police is and what Sherlock Holmes' attitude towards the police is. Just make some notes about that at the top of your page. Okay. And also please be noting this is a shift in narrative focus. This is the newspaper's narrative here. So Holmes's reaction is humorous. Isn't it gorgeous? This is really entertained Holmes. The idea that Athelney Jones has solved this case in this way single-handedly. And again, we have more irony here, where he talks about Athelney Jones having another of his attacks of energy. That Athelney Jones is really only energetic when he's arresting people. So they're joking here that Athelney Jones is going to come around and arrest them if he has one of his attacks of energy. So now we move on to, this is going to be where we see the Baker Street Irregulars. They're arriving at the house, and instantly it's chaos. We hear Mrs. Hudson raising her voice in a wail of expostulation and dismay. Her reaction to the Baker Street Irregulars is one of shock, horror, surprise, potentially anger. Maybe these boys are behaving in a rude manner, not really fitting in with Mrs. Hudson's typical duties. Okay, so no, it's not quite so bad as that. It's the unofficial force, the Baker Street Irregulars. As he spoke, there came a swift pattering of naked feet upon the stairs, a clatter of high voices, and in rushed a dozen dirty and ragged little street Arabs. There was some show of discipline among them. despite their tumultuous entry, for they instantly drew up in line and stood facing us with expectant faces. One of their number, taller and older than the others, stood forward with an air of lounging superiority, which was very funny in such a disreputable little scarecrow. "Got your message, sir," said he, "and bought 'em on sharp. 3 bob and a tanner for tickets." "Here you are," said Holmes, producing some silver. "In future they can report to you, Wiggins, and you to me. I cannot have the house invaded in this way. However, it is just as well that you should all hear the instructions. I want to find the whereabouts of a steam launch called the Aurora. Owner Mordecai Smith, black with 2 red streaks, funnel black with a white band. She is down the river somewhere. I want one boy to be at Mordecai Smith's landing stage opposite Millbank to say if the boat comes back. You must divide it out among yourselves and do both banks thoroughly. Let me know the moment you have news. Is that all clear?" "Yes, governor," said Wiggins. "The old scale of pay and a guinea to the boy who finds the boat. Here's a day in advance. Now off you go." He handed them a shilling each, and away they buzzed down the stairs, and I saw them a moment later, streaming down the street. "If the launch is above the water, they will find her," said Holmes, as he rose from the table and lit his pipe. "They can go everywhere, see everything, overhear everyone." So let's deal with this. The descriptions of the Baker Street Irregulars. A few things to clarify before we start. So these children would be homeless or incredibly poor children. They would be from the lower classes or the underclasses, potentially linked with criminals, and they would be living lives of extreme poverty. And this was a big issue in Victorian society, that there were a lot of children that didn't have enough food, that were forced to go into jobs, that ended up in workhouses. Charles Dickens ended up in a workhouse. His dad had lots and lots of debts as a child. So, all elements of society could be touched by poverty. The second, and there is a lot of misconception around this, the term street Arab, this doesn't refer to race. These boys are not Arabs. This is an idiom to mean homeless or poor boy. So street Arabs refers to them being homeless or poor. So here again, just to go into the imagery around this idea of the Baker Street Irregulars, this could be a play on the regular that was the terminology for police officers at the time, but at the same time, it could talk to them of being not normal, of them using irregular methods, or even Holmes using these irregular methods. We then get some physical description, so a pattering of naked feet, a clatter of high voices. Conan Doyle here uses some really nice sense description. Think about the verbs, the verb pattering, the word clatter. This creates the idea that there was chaos around these children. And in rushed a dozen dirty and ragged little street Arabs. So we have dirty and ragged, and that term street Arab, remember, to mean homeless boys. So these clearly are children living in poverty. They are outside Victorian society. These are others, using that literary term other to mean people outside of society. However, despite the fact that they appear to be ragged and chaotic and dirty and homeless, there was some show of discipline among them. This shows that these boys do stick to some Victorian values. And I think what Conan Doyle is getting at here is if we think about otherness as a scale. So we have the people within Victorian society, your working classes, your middle classes, your upper classes. They are all within Victorian society. They all dress, behave, think in the way that they should, depending on their class, within Victorian society. However, the others, those that are othered within this story, are people that exist outside of Victorian society. So we have Tonga, who I think is at the bottom of the scale. He is other and foreign complete. He is the scariest figure in the whole of this book. Jonathan Small is other. He is a criminal who has been in prison. However, he has lived some of his life in Victorian society, so he does adhere to some of those Victorian values, as we will see as we get towards Jonathan Swift's capture. Here, these boys are other, they are homeless, however they still exist very much within Victorian society, or at least they observe Victorian society, and they see people regimented, they see people existing within hierarchies. And so despite the fact that they are outside of society, they still maintain some of that Victorian hierarchy. And this is seen with there was a show of discipline among them, and one of their number, taller and older than the others, stood forward with an air of lounging superiority. So this shows there is a rank and a hierarchy within their group, much in the same way that there will be a rank and a hierarchy within an army or a business or a factory. You know, there's a boss and there are those underneath the boss. Watson sees this as very funny, as he was a disreputable little scarecrow. So Watson mocks their rank even though he is from the army. Watson worked within an organisation where these kind of rankings existed anyway. Yet he sees that it is funny. Maybe he sees it's funny because of the irony within there. And just to touch on this, I know I haven't highlighted it, but this metaphor that he was a disreputable little scarecrow. You know, this word scarecrow talks about his neatness, but also his weight. So this shows that these boys were thin. You know, they were needy. They were desperate. They do need this money. More working class dialect. Brought him on sharp, 3 bob and a tanner for tickets. So again, he is requesting very little pay for the work that they're about to do. And we get more of Holmes's attitude towards the working class. He's used these boys before. They're going to help him. However, he uses the word invaded. I cannot have the house invaded in this way. It's a very derogatory term. And again, talks very much about an us and them. In this, he doesn't see that Holmes and the Baker Street Irregulars are working together. He sees that he is employing them. And they just need to get out there and do their job. He doesn't care about them. So we get more details of the plot, more money, more reference to the shilling, and I worked this out. So a shilling in Victorian times, that was 12p. If you were to scale that up, that would be around £10 in today's money. So Sherlock Holmes is paying these boys £10 a day. That is slave labour. That isn't very much money at all. And again, Holmes can afford to give him more. There is additional imagery around the shilling, and I've not written this down, but it's worth bearing in mind. There was a phrase within the Victorian era that went right on to World War I, World War II, and that phrase was to take the king's shilling. So the idea that the king would pay a soldier a shilling, and once you're paid that shilling, you are contractually obliged to serve that king. Here we have a very similar situation. Holmes is paying the boys a shilling, and with that shilling, they are contractually obliged to serve him. We also see this at the beginning of the chapter with Jack, don't we? Where he gives Jack a shilling. So this kind of shows Holmes's limit to paying off these working class, these underclass people. It isn't very much. Now Holmes says they can go everywhere, see everything, overhear everyone. He believes they work as spies. They also blend in really nicely because poverty was such a big issue in Victorian society. There were a lot of poor people everywhere. So a poor person at the docks isn't really going to stand out in the same way that Sherlock Holmes in the docks might stand out. All of this leads us to the question, how does Holmes exploit the Baker Street Irregulars? You know, how is he exploiting the Baker Street Irregulars here? And again, I want you to take a minute, just think a little bit about that, maybe answer that question. Okay, we're nearly at the end now. So, I expect to hear before evening that they have spotted her. In the meanwhile, we could do nothing but await results. We cannot pick up the broken trail until we find either the Aurora or Mr. Mordecai Smith. Toby could eat these scraps, I dare say. Are you going to bed, Holmes? No, I am not tired. I have a curious constitution. I never remember feeling tired by work, though idleness exhausts me completely. I am going to smoke and to think over this queer business to which my fair client has introduced us. If ever man had an easy task, this of ours ought to be. Wooden-legged men are not so common, but the other man must, I should think, be absolutely unique. That other man again! I have no wish to make a mystery of him, to you anyway, but you must have formed your own opinion. Now do consider the data. Diminutive footmarks, toes never fitted by boots, naked feet, stone-headed wooden mace, great agility, small poisoned darts. What do you make of all this? A savage! I exclaimed. Perhaps one of those Indians who were the associates of Jonathan Small. Hardly that, said he. When first I saw signs of strange weapons, I was inclined to think so, but the remarkable character of the footprints caused me to reconsider my views. Some of the inhabitants of the Indian peninsula are small men, but none could have left such marks as that. The Hindu proper has long and thin feet. The sandal-wearing Mohammedan has the great toe well separated from the others, because the thong is commonly passed between. These little darts, too, could only be shot in one way. They are from a blowpipe. Now then, where are we to find our savage? Okay, so just really thinking on this page about how does Holmes represent Victorian values? And we're going to get into this a lot more as we progress. So the broken trail, this is the state of the investigation. Holmes considers it broken. You know, he recognises now that they can't progress until they find either the boat or Mr. Smith. Now here Holmes demonstrates a typical Victorian work ethic. He says, "No, I am not tired. I never remember feeling tired by work, though idleness exhausts me completely." So this is the idea that Victorian people should work, and enjoy work and be thrilled by work, but idleness should be something that they try to avoid. And Holmes here does this. You know, again, I've used the maxim. I'm going to use it again when we get there. But this is the idea. A change is as good as a rest. You know, if you get bored or tired with something, just do something else. Don't rest. Don't stop. Just keep going and going and going. This also links to Watson's comment right back at the beginning of the novel that Holmes was like an automaton, a calculating machine. Machines don't feel tired. Machines don't have to stop work to rest. Holmes, like a machine, doesn't feel tired, doesn't have to stop work to rest. He just has to keep at it, keep thinking, keep thinking, keep thinking. So then we have Holmes challenge Watson even more. So he says, consider the data, and asks him where he thinks that this mysterious person has come from. Watson, a savage. Yeah. This demonstrates a little bit of the attitude towards indigenous people within the colonies. The idea that any indigenous person within the colony must be a savage, and all of the connotations that go around that word savage. Animalistic, no control, murderous, beastly. This is, again, Victorian fear of the colonies and otherness within the colonies. However, Watson then goes on to make the wrong deduction that it must be one of those Indian people who were associated with Jonathan Small. And Holmes uses his deduction here. So he observes the small footmarks. He has deduced that it must be someone of an indigenous, it must be an indigenous person from somewhere in the colonies. He's deduced that. He's now using knowledge to explain to Watson why it can't be one of the people that Jonathan Small was associating with, because he understands and has knowledge that Hindu people, people from India, have long, thin feet, rather than very small feet, like this person has. At the same time, he has knowledge that Mohammedan people, this would be Muslims, have a great toe separated from the others because the part on the sandal that goes between the toes fits between the big toe and the next toe. So he if this was a footprint of a Muslim at this time, then it wouldn't be small, and you'd be able to observe in it that foot shape. So Holmes here is now using his knowledge to show why Watson is wrong. And it also helps him to deduce better. He also talks about the blowpipe, and that isn't something that would be used in India at the time. So where are we to find are savage. Where in the world are blowpipes used? South America? I hazarded. He stretched his hand up and took down a bulky volume from the shelf. This is the first volume of a gazetteer which is now being published. It may be looked upon as the very latest authority. What have we here? Andaman Islands, situated 340 miles to the north of Sumatra in the Bay of Bengal. What's all this? Moist climate, coral reefs, sharks, Port Blair, convict barracks, Rutland Island, cottonwoods. Here we are. The Aborigines of the Andaman Islands may perhaps claim the distinction of being the smallest race upon this earth, though some anthropologists prefer the Bushmen of Africa, the Digger Indians of America, and the Terra del Fuegians. The average height is rather below 4 feet, although many full-grown adults may be found who are very much smaller than this. They are a fierce, morose, and intractable people, though capable of forming most devoted friendships when their confidence has once been gained. Mark that, Watson. Now then, listen to this. They are naturally hideous, having large, misshapen heads, small, fierce eyes, and distorted features. Their feet and hands, however, are remarkably small. So intractable and fierce are they that all the efforts of the British official have failed to win them over in any degree. They have always been a terror to shipwrecked crews, braining the survivors with their stone-headed clubs or shooting them with their poisoned arrows. These massacres are invariably concluded by a cannibal feast. Nice, amiable people, Watson. If this fellow had been left to his own unaided devices, this affair might have taken an even more ghastly turn. I fancy that, even as it is, Jonathan Small would give a good deal not to have employed him. Okay, so a couple of things now. So we really are getting into the nitty-gritty of Victorian fear and colonialism and indigenous peoples. Before we go into it, just a couple of things I want you to think about. So we need to think about, how is Tonga's home made to seem exotic and dangerous? What language is used to make it seem exotic and dangerous that will better communicate with a Victorian audience to make them feel fear? The second thing is this idea of a Eurocentric view. This is the idea that everything that comes from Europe is normal and everything else in the world is wrong, is abnormal. So you could take, for instance, think about the language that's been used around indigenous people, talking about dirty little savages, brown-faced monkey men, all that kind of stuff, This is the idea, skin colour. White is the skin colour within Europe. This is seen as normal in this novel. Any other skin colour is seen as wrong, along the racist terms. The traditions, the dress, the things that we do in Europe are seen as normal. Things that Indian people would do, things that the people on the Andaman Islands would do, these are seen as wrong. I'm going to touch on this in a moment. So here, a little detail for Holmes. He talks about this book that he pulls off the shelf. It may be looked upon as the very latest authority. Holmes trusts books. He's a rational human being. We now get some description of Tonga's home. It is a moist climate. There are coral reefs, sharks, Port Blair, that's the closest place, convict barracks, Rutland Islands, cottonwoods, etc., etc., etc. So it's hot. That's exotic. Coral is exotic. Sharks, dangerous. Port Blair, that's just the closest port to the Andaman Islands. Convict barracks, that's a clue. We know that Jonathan Small was a convict. We know that Major Sholto and Captain Morstan worked together when guarding the convict barracks. So this is a clue. Cottonwoods, maybe that's the industry. Now again, we are given the idea that Tonga is very small. This links him with the clue. This links him with the footprints. He's below 4 feet. He's shown as dangerous, fierce, morose, intractable people. The idea that he cannot adapt, that he is very fixed in his ways. This is a stereotypical view of indigenous people, particularly people that would live within tribes, that they are very fixed, primitive, violent people. However, in juxtaposition to this, they are people capable of forming most devoted friendships. This shows that Tonga does have some loyalty, and again, we'll see this developed as we get more information about Tonga. Now, this I think shows this Eurocentric view of the world. You know, the book that Holmes is reading says they are unnaturally hideous, having large misshapen heads, small fierce eyes, and distorted features. Well, I wouldn't think that would be the case for other indigenous people on the Andaman Islands. They wouldn't describe each other as hideous. They wouldn't describe each other as having large misshapen heads. That's their normal for them. In the same way that if you look at people across the world, people all look different. But where you are from, that is your normal. No way of looking is the right way and the wrong way. However, here, the book shows that Tonga's way of looking is very much the wrong way. It is a grotesque way of looking to a European, because with a Eurocentric view of the world, white, brown hair, blonde hair, blue eyes, brown eyes, the way that a white European would look would be seen as normal, the correct way of looking. Now, this is very much just talking about Victorian fear, in particular Victorian fear of indigenous people from the colonies. He says they have always been a terror to shipwrecked crews, so that crews that have shipwrecked on the islands, these people from the Andaman Islands would butcher them and kill them and be violent towards them, invariably concluding through a cannibal feast. So the idea that Tonga is eating other people, is eating the flesh of other people, particularly with a shipwrecked crew, probably being white European, that Tonga and his indigenous people are eating white Europeans. This is exaggerated, potentially, and a little bit slanderous, maybe, but it definitely talks to Victorian fear of indigenous people and the colonies. And definitely, this is really our first proper look at Tonga and information about Tonga. Please remember these things, because if Tonga were to come up on the exam, then you definitely have to talk about this. So here, I fancy that, even as it is, Jonathan Small would give a good deal not to have employed him. Jonathan Small, an Englishman, would not want to be with a savage. At this point, Holmes doesn't know about Jonathan Small and Tonga's relationship. From an external point of view, from a white English point of view at this point, it would seem very confusing to Sherlock Holmes as to why Jonathan Small would employ someone who was a savage, in inverted commas. I'm doing those with my fingers, you can't see. Why he would rely on an indigenous person to help with his plan. However, this is not true and shows Holmes's prejudice. This shows that Holmes is prejudiced towards anyone that isn't white and English, because Jonathan Small and Tonga are very, very good friends, as we will see in the final chapter. And as we will see in the final chapter, my personal opinion is that Jonathan Small is way, way more liberal and tolerant and open-minded compared to Sherlock Holmes. But we will get there. We will get there. Finally. It is more than I can tell. Since, however, we had already determined that Small had come from the Andamans. It is not so very wonderful that this islander should be with him. No doubt we shall know all about it in time. Look here, Watson. You look regularly done. Lie down there on the sofa and see if I can put you to sleep. He took up his violin from the corner, and as I stretched myself out, he began to play some low, dreamy, melodious air. His own, no doubt, for he had a remarkable gift for improvisation. I have a vague remembrance of his gaunt limbs, his earnest face, and the rise and fall of his bow. Then I seemed to be floated peacefully away on a soft sea of sound, until I found myself in dreamland, with the sweet face of Mary Morstan looking down upon me. Okay, so here we see more difference between Holmes and Watson. Watson is looking really, really tired. Holmes is going to help him to sleep with music. We see more of Holmes's extraordinary skills. Not only is he a great detective, a great boxer, a great communicator with people from all walks of life. Not only is he able to advise the police, write papers, come up with new forensic activities, he's also fantastic at improvising music on a violin. You know, Holmes has the skills to be all things. And again, this is very much a Victorian idea that you should be able to do everything in life. You should be skilled at everything. Okay, yeah, as I've said, Holmes is also an amazing musician, on top of detective, lecturer, scientist, boxer, climber, all of these things Holmes is fantastic at. He truly has the power to have all the powers. Okay, so that is chapter 8. I hope it was useful. I'll try and get chapter 9 done as quick as possible, and we can get this novel all wrapped up. Okay, right, take care, guys. Speak to you later. Bye bye.